biological intervention. And so what this does is allows for us to minimize, hopefully, transmission so that we all want to work together to protect our vulnerable populations. So hopefully we can gain a herd immunity, those of us that survive this illness, which will be many, 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 by far the majority of us. We can also then protect our communities from future infection if we do have long-term immunity to this, which some studies are showing that will have an immunity so that the virus won't be able to hopefully continue to come back into our communities. But really, because it's such a new virus, we still don't know. Science really hasn't been able to answer all the questions that all of us have.
You mentioned convalescent something. What was that?
Okay, so that was complex. Convalescent serum or sera. So big picture, when these packets of information come into contact with our cells and then replicate themselves, our immune cells can detect them and then create something, these Y-shaped molecules called immune globulins that float around and then discombobulate the virus. So they deactivate it rather. So they'll make it so that that virus can't then, as its lunar landing module self, land on the cell. So it's blocked up. So can't land, and therefore can halt your infection, in addition to your cells being able to gobble up infected cells and affected cells. So having said that, people who have had an immune response and have created that healthy immune system to the virus, they'll have these Y-shaped immune globulins in them. So blood has blood cells and then the blood liquid, and the blood liquid is called the serum. And we're very familiar with that, of course, in Nome at the end of the Iditarod and the diphtheria serum history. So the idea is that sometimes in the past, during certain outbreaks, particularly with Ebola, that we've found that convalescent serum can help. I understand. I've been reading a lot about it and how I think that we could be using that, especially for folks who are sick, or to also protect those on our front lines to minimize transmission to them. I think that also, or rather to treat. I guess what I feel like we need to do is use the science and look to the experts. And I also feel like I wish I saw them speaking to us more and giving us this direct information. What I find challenging is the World Health Organization, the CDC, the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services, they're all giving me information, and it kind of comes at different times. And then I'm also, of course, trying to get resources from medical journals and also from physicians and patients alike. So it is a challenging time for all of us, but what is actually uniquely inspiring, I suppose, is that we are all experiencing this together across the world. And what I also think about is Grandma Rita Blumenstein telling us that there would be a time in the future when we would all be interconnected by what grandmother spider had woven, a web, and that would help to unite us all across the world. So now is a time when we really do need to use our resources to get important information across to each other. And it's not a time to be motivated by fear, but rather by information. Education is the great equalizer. That's why we all wear our same gowns when we graduate, right? We're all equal from the same place, speaking from that empowered information. So looking to the real science, being cautious to use our important scientific protocols before instating interventions such as vaccines. We want to be using safe vaccines that are proven when they're ready to be used on people. We want to be using science to use the appropriate types of medications when and if they're safe.
Has your practice been impacted by the last 2 weeks?
Absolutely. So I had recent travel And I did not realize that travel would be impacting me so much in that it potentially exposed me to the virus and then exposed me to a quarantine. And further, the needs of my patients have increased quite a bit. So I think about it as me doing my business as regular, which is quite busy. And then a slight pandemic occurs, so it creates this tension, right, that you're talking about. There's my needs, there's my need to serve my elders. There's this dichotomy. There's so much on our radar screens right now that it's really hard to sort out what truly needs to happen since so much has changed. I have to ask people about all of their potential risk factors and contacts and figuring out their travel and their work situations. So I'm spending quite a bit of time currently writing letters of excuses so folks don't have to go to work who are in the higher risk categories, so folks don't have to travel to places where there is potentially endemic spread. Really, we're trying to get people medications and just help folks to be reassured during this time when there is a lot of uncertainty. But certainly we have each other to rely upon. And I think that, using the internet as a tool for reliable information is very helpful for me. But also, we can overdo that. So we can spend a little too much time relatively on media, and that can be overwhelming. So taking media breaks is important. And what the World Health Organization recommends is considering maybe a twice a day check in at this point for those of us that are feeling stressed. I do find a lot of the recommendations from the World Health Organization and the CDC helpful for those of us that are in quarantine, because my life personally has changed so much, my practice has changed so much, but every single one of my patients' lives has changed. So whether it is having recently returned from a different country or a different state, or caring for a family member who maybe has symptoms, we're realizing in retrospect the runny nose that we have for the past month isn't such a little deal anymore, and we actually do have to be on quarantine. It's hard, it's challenging. So to individualize that care and get the information out to every person who has a concern, that's the work that I'm doing right now, in addition to the regular medicine and trying to stretch that into a phone call. It's really interesting. And also, the other thing that I feel is really important is trying to support those providers who are on the front lines. And so I'm trying to do as much of my work as I can to keep folks out of the congested area. So there's a lot of triage, not just for my patients, but for their family members. And even family members in other countries, just trying to reassure and coordinate resources for people. It's a very dynamic time.
How do you feel about the response, the mandatory shutdowns? And would you say, from your opinion, would you say that this is an overreaction, or do you think that this is a legitimate caution?
I strongly believe this is a legitimate caution. I have to use the science, and I look at the mathematics of the doubling time of the infection with over 5,000 cases in the United States today. I'm concerned. I'm concerned about our resources. I trust our providers are well trained. My concern is that in Alaska, we have relatively limited resources that have already been stretched so that oftentimes our hospitals are full prior to pandemic. So I know we're doing our best, but I also know that the CDC and World Health Organization were making recommendations months ago to prepare for the supply chain, identifying things that would be needed in your home. Preparing your emergency prepared kits was also recommended by the Department of Health and Social Services. And when I look back at that, I wonder, how come I didn't get an email or a memo? Like, I know I've been doing my best to read the JAMA articles that were published that showed that there was folks without symptoms who were spreading the disease outside of Wuhan. And I have to say, There was a lady, unfortunately, who didn't have symptoms and then accidentally spread the disease to 5 of her family members. And I saw that journal article published in mid-February, and that's when I really started to get worried. And I felt increasingly over time uneasy that we're not getting the information fast enough to the people. And as a provider, I personally feel like in the community, even though I'm told our hospitals have been preparing, what I also hear is that our hospitals are short on things like personal protective equipment and staff. Here in Anchorage, I hear that we're trying our best to keep up with these things, but also have put a call out to other local resources to obtain help with personal protective equipment when necessary. But I do feel also that many of our smaller clinics don't necessarily have gowns and masks. And so what providers are being asked to do right now in many clinics that haven't had the benefit of their sole provider being on quarantine for a week. So many clinics are continuing to see patients. Hospitals are continuing to see patients who plan to get for preoperative visits now, which requires my work to order labs and order studies so that they can get surgeries next week and 2 weeks from now. So it creates a lot of pressure for us to do the regular medicine while doing the pandemic medicine without what feels like a unified force. There's not a unified leadership that I'm hearing. And I feel like we didn't quarantine soon enough in some ways, because I know that people have been sick here for 3+ weeks, maybe longer. And because I couldn't test due to the limitation with access to testing, which is a whole long story in itself, but I was only supposed to order tests if folks were febrile and having difficulty with their breathing.
Febrile?
Oh, fever temperature greater than a 101.
Okay.
Yeah. So if folks weren't having a fever with respiratory distress, I couldn't order the test. Not only that, the test oftentimes, as was evidenced in Wuhan early on, for their test anyways, it wasn't detecting people who were mildly ill, or sometimes they'd have a transient positivity that was only during a portion of their being their carrier. So we find that what I hear anyways is that the tests are better or more accurate when folks are more sick. And so for those of us that are having more mild illness or not necessarily needing that hospitalization, we're generally still not utilizing those tests. We have to use our clinical judgment anyways. But the purpose of the testing to me is to detect where the illness is so that we can try to isolate those folks, identify the communities, isolate those communities so it's not spreading out of that area. And so that's what we're doing right now, is creating this capsule of a red zone here. So anything outside of your immediate control area could be potentially infected with virus. Or if you are in your own red zone in your house like me, then I have to frequently clean my house and also be aware that the viral particles could be shedding here and could live for up to 3 days or possibly more on surfaces. So right now, the CDC is recommending that folks quarantine to homes for at least until you're free of symptoms for 72 hours, and that after that, you practice social isolation to make sure that you're not passing things through your respiratory droplets. That's why people recommend in some places that 6-foot distance and those kinds of things.
That's a good reminder then, because I haven't really been wiping anything down here. I was just like, well, if I'm just at home, it's just me, and my partner. But
so I have to think about the science, and I am not a virologist, but I do think of this idea of like the inoculation, how much inoculate you get. What does that mean? How many particles do we ingest or breathe in? I don't know if it makes a difference if you breathe in 100 or 1,000, or if you breathe in 2. But certainly, it seems to make sense that if we don't inoculate ourselves with more and more of the virus, or with a large amount rather, that until you have your immunity against the virus, that you're minimizing inoculation of yourself and others, and also